Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Betsy Goldstein, and this is season 2 of 6-1 Forward. And today, my guest is Jon Melchi with the BIA, Executive Director and leader in the housing space. So, we're going to talk about housing today and what's happening in the region, but a little bit different than some of the other conversations you might have heard about housing. Where are we stuck? Where are there opportunities? What can we do different? And what are we projecting for the future? And so, Jon, to start us today, share with us what the BIA is. What does it stand for?
Thanks for having me, Betsy. So the BIA stands for Building Industry Association, and we've been around for over 80 years representing the residential development and construction industry in the Central Ohio region. When we were founded, we were called the Columbus Home Builders Association, and we're focused primarily in Franklin County. But over the years, as the organization and the region have grown, we now represent the entire Central Ohio MSA, and our builders range from everybody from America's kind of largest leading single family builders to a one person remodeling company, and everybody from Habitat for Humanity and our nonprofit affordable housing builders and developers to some of Columbus's largest multifamily mixed use developers. So we touch just about every side of the housing coin, and all the people who help those projects go are members of our association.
So, how long have you been at the BIA now?
7.5 years.
What are the differences from the day you walked in and the conversations you have today versus back then?
I always joke that there's the job they tell you you're going to get, and then there's the job you actually get. And I think one of the first things that I can relay is different is when the BIA used to have a longtime government affairs consultant named Malcolm Porter, who's a legend. He's actually going into our BIA Hall of Fame. He and I met prior to me taking this job, and I remember him talking a lot about where we were building at that time. And it was Delaware County
Mhm.
and some in Columbus, but primarily for utilities, and a little bit in maybe Union County, and that was about it. And now, as we talk about housing projects, our builders are building absolutely everywhere in the region, and that's been a huge shift. And just, I think the conversations that our folks are having and the urgency right now is ramped up over the last 7.5 years.
I think we talk a lot about where the challenges are, but clearly in 7 years, you've seen progress in some ways. And I'm wondering if there are some examples that you could point to where you've seen us maybe right wrongs or start to make better processes and procedures to bring housing into the market.
I think the thing that I can tell you most immediately is that there's an awareness of the housing shortage in this region that wasn't there before. And while I'd like to take credit for it, Malcolm and my predecessor, Jim Hills, had started this process of doing a housing needs assessment that was completed early on in my tenure with the BIA that demonstrated there was a need for housing. And we've since updated that. And when we've been able to show that there's a need for 17 to 19,000 homes per year in this region, that's now cited as the actual number. So I think previously we would hear from communities that say there's not really a housing shortage. There's building going everywhere. That's what I hear. There's always, and in reality, there's not, and the numbers back that up. So I guess they say the solving a problem, the first step is acknowledging it's there. I think we've gotten to that acknowledgement point. Now we're talking about how to actually implement solutions to increase housing creation.
And the BIA is different. We talk about the overall housing needs and the number of agencies, nonprofits that reside in that area. And it is a hot button topic. There's a lot of attention to it. People recognize there's an issue. But the BIA, in my opinion, sets itself apart in more of an advocacy role as well. And can you talk a little bit about that piece or maybe what you're working on or what you've been successful with?
Yeah. So building anything is a highly regulated process. The simplest way I tell people is we can't do anything without the government in some form or fashion saying you can build this here. Um, and then there are processes that we have to work through. So our job is to serve as kind of a facilitator and liaison between the regulating entities, meaning the government, and the builders who want to build those homes. And I often tell people our builders' jobs is to build homes, and they're working on projects. Our job is to work on processes. So we we serve to help improve the building process in a way that benefits both the community and the builders. So, I think routinely you can cite our work with local communities in improving zoning codes and trying to improve processes. We have regular meetings with the city of Columbus to talk about how we can do process improvements, things that our members can do better, and things that the city and other municipalities can do better. And that's where we serve. We think that we fill a void, and our processes are, when we talk about process improvement, it's not meant to benefit just one builder or one industry specifically. We really believe that a rising tide floats all boats here, and the answer to housing production is housing production at all levels. So everything we work on seeks to improve housing production at all income levels for all buyers and all product types in Central Ohio.
I think that's one of the other things that makes conversations with you unique is you have a lens on other markets, other cities, and what they're doing. And I know that you've had a white paper in the past with Indy, and you point to that a lot. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about what that process looks like there versus here. And so much as if you are buying something here, a piece of land, and you want to develop it into X, and I'm doing the same thing in Indy, what does that look like for each of us? And where are they maybe doing things different or better or have a better path to success for housing?
Yeah, if I could take just a quick step back, uh, this conversation got started. We looked at our annual permit numbers and we looked back and we said, how is it that Indianapolis, which, if you are familiar with Central Ohio, Indianapolis is really similar. It's 3 hours to the west and it's the state capital in the middle of the state. And its rate of growth is not unsimilar to Central Ohio. They build approximately, and I think in 2024, it's 4,000 more single family homes at about $100,000 cheaper per home. And I asked our national builders, and this is one of the benefits of our membership. They share information. They're willing to try to improve the building climate for everybody. We've got folks who are building in multiple parts of the United States and specifically in Indianapolis. And I said, how do we, what's the difference there? And one of our large builders here, their division president, used to work in Indianapolis and said, let me tell you all of these differences. And when they presented it, it was just an eye opener. And let's just start out by saying, um, Ohio, have learned, is a very strong home rule state. And that means that every local jurisdiction in the state of Ohio kind of has a say in zoning and what gets built. And that means all of our townships, all of our villages, all of our cities all have a different say, and they can have different zoning requirements. And when you look west towards Indiana and Indianapolis specifically, that's just not the case. They have um, municipal townships do not zone in Indiana. That's done at the county level, and municipalities can zone up to 5 miles outside of their boundaries, and that makes for a really simplified process because our builders in those markets are not having to navigate 20 plus different zoning codes in one county. They're
Sure.
navigating four or five. So that is by far one of the most, I think, noticeable changes. They don't have a zoning referendum the way that we do in the state of Ohio. They also, just little things that you wouldn't think of. In Indiana, they have a building materials list, and that means if a product is listed on the state of Indiana's building materials list, it can be used to build a home in Indiana. Here, our builders negotiate municipality by municipality on what sort of materials can be used and what the architecture needs to look like. And I understand that in historic districts and in legacy areas of the city, but what we've seen is kind of the Magnolia TV takeover of some of our township trustees and city councils, where they said, well, we want everything to look like this. At the same time, they say everything looks alike.
Sure.
So those are real challenges. And, there's two other points that I would make. How they handle utilities is done at a much more regional basis, and their tap fees for water and sewer, and that's a conversation we may or may not get into, but huge cost drivers, and it allows for better planning of infrastructure for those communities. And the last thing I'll add is what we've seen there is there's school districts. They have fewer school districts to navigate, and they are much larger schools. That doesn't mean they perform any better or worse. They're just larger. And here in Ohio, we've 600 plus school districts, and many of them are um, not very large, so we don't have economies of scale, and that increases cost down the line.
I want to talk about the school issue in a second, but the tapping fees, I've heard you talk about it, and I'm not sure that people who are outside of the industry know what a tapping fee is.
And I didn't know when I talked about the job you get versus the job you think you're going to get. I did not think they did not have on the job description. We'll spend a lot of time thinking about sewer, um, and it's pretty simple. If you can't flush a toilet or run a dishwasher, you can't sell a house.
Right.
And we need to be able to tie into central sewer systems in order to have any economies of scale. Otherwise, you're building on septic systems, and I don't know that that in large numbers is good for the environment, and it's not really cost effective. So the challenge, boy, I'm gonna get into the weeds a little bit
Do it.
here. Okay, part of the reason Columbus has grown the way it has is because the city of Columbus was the largest utility provider for the region, and when you think of Dublin and Westerville and Grove City and all of these communities outside around 270, they've grown with Columbus Utilities as their backbone. But also with Columbus providing utilities came the threat of annexation. And many communities, in an effort to prevent annexation, created their own utility districts and said, um, basically, we're going to create these districts so Columbus can't annex anymore. Simultaneously, Columbus, for a period of time, said, we don't want to annex anymore because it's too expensive to provide services such as EMS and police to a lot of these growing areas. But these districts that were created are expensive to run on a smaller scale. And as growth has come in kind of the regulatory environment, it costs a lot more to build a sewer plant than it cost
Mhm.
5 to 10 years ago. And this is something the expansion over COVID, the cost of these plants has gone up considerably. So, in order to pay for that, usually the districts, they have two choices. They could say, we're going to increase the fees on our users, or we are going to make the developers pretty much pay for the entirety of the expansion. And they've, by and large, have chosen the latter. And what that means is every time in Delaware County somebody goes to build a new home, it costs almost or $20,000 to hook into the water and sewer system that is there. And when you contrast that with, I think the city of Columbus is around $7,000. So a $13,000 difference, that's a huge number. And we have this stat we used from NAHB, which is for every $1,000 a price goes up in Central Ohio, 1,000 people are priced out. So if you have a $10,000 to $15,000 premium to get, utility tapped in, it's a huge price driver. And then a lot of times, some of these areas are where you would consider price sensitive. You're like, oh, we're in this area, we're going to have a chance to get first time home buyers. Well, now we've layered an additional $15,000 worth of cost onto them for the privilege of using utilities. So the cost is there. And then what we've seen in a lot of growing communities is they're tapped out, meaning
Sure.
they don't have the capacity to increase their treatment facilities absent a big expansion. This is going on in the Licking Regional District
Mhm.
as they've kind of grown from the Southwest Licking Community Water and Sewer District, now Licking Regional. You know, our builders are in that market and they don't have the ability to build homes because they won't have access to permit or to taps um, to hook up to those houses. We see this in Plain City. There are a lot of homes that are sidelined right now until that facility is constructed, same as Asheville. So around this region, we're seeing homes that have gotten zoned and are approved that are sidelined because of water and sewer. And quite frankly, I don't think anybody thought about water and sewer significantly until Intel a couple of years
Sure.
ago. And now, as we're all coming to the realization that, oh, this is a could be an advantage for us, but right now in the short term, because of our lack of facilities and capacities across the region, maybe it's not helping so much.
How are other major cities, Indy, for example, Austin, Nashville, how do they operate when it comes to the tapping fees, the utility piece? Are they able to circumvent that cost, or is there a different model that they're using?
I think my understanding is those markets have a much more of a regional approach,
Okay.
which has allowed them to scale out. And I think also, if they are not scared to occasionally increase fees on utilities, for water and sewer services to help augment improvements and capacity increases. So, I think um, ideally you'd like to see fewer small districts and more, even if it's not one central district, more districts combined. But the way, again, we do utilities and how it dictates growth has led to a lot of conflict in a lot of parts around the region where some people want to have territory, if you would, but not because they want to serve it, but because they want to prevent growth. And, that's currently a discussion out in Licking County.
So let's talk about that a little bit because you and I have talked separately about schools and the impact of bringing housing to schools. And there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of preconceived ideas around apartments, especially, and the impacts that those have on school districts. And I think you have some numbers, or you've had numbers in the past
Yeah.
about what it actually is versus the perception of what it might be.
Yeah. And I think apartment production in the central Ohio region has been okay. But I would say it's been masked a little bit because almost the vast majority of apartment construction has occurred within the city of Columbus and been approved. Where we've really lagged is apartment communities and multifamily developments outside of 270. And again, that push comes a lot of times as some project goes up, that quote unquote it's going to flood the schools, and that's just not the case. And I think our numbers show that it's less than 0.09 students per unit in 20 or more developments with 20 or more units in them. So, number one, I think it's a misnomer that a lot of students come out of new developments. Now, personally, so what if they did?
Right.
Um, you know, People have to have a place to live, and I say this probably because I lived in apartments when I was a kid. So maybe I'm a little more sensitive to it than others, but um, it it seems wrong to me that an argument coming from the schools is that we can't take any more children to educate. And what it's saying is our children that were here first get first dibs on education, and everybody else, good luck. I think school district boundaries are drawn by the state of Ohio. They're not drawn by the BIA of Central Ohio. They're not drawn by my members. They are drawn by the state of Ohio. And people are allowed to do business activity within those districts. I think clearly we're 20 plus years into talking about school funding at the state of Ohio level. Our growing districts are penalized,
Mhm.
and not supported in the same way that some of the legacy communities and districts are in the state of Ohio. But this isn't necessarily a funding issue in terms of there's not enough dollars. I think our studies showed we spend more per student than Indiana and Tennessee and North Carolina and Florida. Um, Maybe it's how those dollars are allocated is the real question. And I think it kind of aligns with all of these issues in that we have so many entities that we're navigating. When you look at Indiana has fewer school districts, and in the South they often have county-wide schools. So there are fewer boundaries and kind of arbitrary lines that have been drawn that impact housing and development. And I think everybody knows if you're on this side of the street, you get to go to Upper Arlington.
Mhm.
And if you're on the other side of this street, you're going to the city of Columbus and the impact that has on housing costs and property values and what you're allowed to do just across the street. So we've been navigating that in this region for some time. But as we grow into some of the more, I don't want to call them, let's call them exurban markets because they're not really rural, but they're also not what you'd call a traditional build out subdivision, like your Worthingtons or Westervilles, et cetera. That's a real challenge. I think of some of these schools, they're having to think about what the next levy is going to be
Mm.
because the state of Ohio restricts how they can't build to capacity in 10 years. My understanding is they have to build to what it's going to be in 5 years, and they do a good job. But then if growth continues to come, they're behind the eight ball almost as soon as that school opens.
I think it's interesting the role that you're in. It's almost as if you are seeing two separate sides of a story, too. When we talk about Licking County, and when I was doing the presentation, I used to say it didn't matter what community I stood in. Everyone was saying we need housing, not here. We need it there. Everyone was kind of pointing the finger and trying to move it somewhere else. The rural story, we talk about school districts, but there's often resistance. We're sitting in the short north right now and we're in tenfold space right off of High Street. But housing and the opposition to it happens in our urban core also. A lot of times developers get a really bad rap. Why is there tax abatement? Can you talk a little bit about what you see in the core
Yeah.
versus what you see on the outside?
As we record this, I think I like how, we hear the term political division, and I can go to the bluest part of Franklin County, and then I can go to the reddest part of Madison County. And a developer will pitch a project and you will hear the exact same argument. It is like the one unifying thing. And I joke, you go to some of these areas and they've got this sign in their yard that says, no matter who you are, where you're from, you're my neighbor, unless you want to
Unless,
build
yeah,
right down the street from my house. And, then in the red areas, it's how do we keep government out of my life unless it's me dictating four-sided architecture and half-acre lots 3 miles from where I live. And I think this is in the urban core of the United States. This is not a uniquely Columbus problem,
right,
right? As you read around, the ability of our urban core in our largest metro areas to provide adequate housing and cost-effective living is a huge issue. And I think it's topic of what I'll call the abundance discussion that's happening amongst the political left right now of, okay, we've got a lot of great ideas, but can we execute on them? And I think that's been a challenge for a lot of metro areas, and they've turned to make the development community the boogeyman.
right,
And the reality is, looking around this region, your neighborhood, guess who built it?
right,
A developer. But there's not too many movies you turn on and the developer's a hero for
right,
building a bunch of people houses.
right.
Usually they're the evil bad guy. And we've allowed that to be weaponized and used to prevent housing creation. And, you know, ultimately, are developers risking capital to build? Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
And they need to get a return on that investment. There's not enough money in this city, in this state, or in this country to have government build the amount of housing we need. And if we've learned anything over the last 20 to 30 years is that if they did it, it probably wouldn't be done that effectively.
right.
So we need the private sector to be a part of the housing solution here. And, you know, the people I represent are good people. They are not the enemy. And often they're treated as such. And, it's disappointing. And we've seen again the hijacking of processes in order to delay construction. And I just have never understood how somebody at the end of the day can say, boy, I'm going to put on my tombstone, prevented a couple hundred people from having a house.
Right.
And that's the bridge a lot of these in Hill people are willing to lay down on.
It's interesting when I was doing a lot of the presentations, I would ask people in large rooms, how many of you are concerned about whether or not your kids will be able to come back and be able to buy a home in the community that they grew up? And, at least 50, sometimes 60, 70% of the room would raise their hand. And these were the same people in some instances that would turn around and say, we don't want all of that here. We can't have both. There has to be a compromise to that somewhere. Hopefully there will be.
It, I hope so too. And I'm more hopeful than maybe I was,
That's good.
18 months ago. But I think because the central Ohio and Columbus region has grown so steadily for so long, it's really hard to envision this region failing.
Right.
And so people say, well, yeah, I don't like that project, but the next one, but I'll support the next one that comes along down the pipe. I think what should concern all of us is our housing costs are getting to the point where, you know, we're going to price ourselves out of jobs. And, we don't have the mountains to sell as a sales point. We don't have an ocean to sell as
That's
a
right.
sales point. This is a great city with a lot of benefits, and I love this community. Um, but one of our things that we've been able to hang our hat on is housing affordability and cost of living to live in a great community. And that's something that's a real threat to us, and it's self-inflicted.
Right. No, it is. As we talk about where we've been in the last year, now things look a little bit different too as we look at tariffs and we look at the climate to bring housing into the market is changing. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that, if your developers are talking about what that might do to development projects.
Yeah, one of the largest national builders, Lennar, is not in this market. But I was reading their quarterly report, and their CEO had said that for them nationally, they'd not seen an impact on tariffs or immigration related labor um, to date. Um, that doesn't mean it's not going to have an impact. And I think if we learned anything from 2016 through 2020 and since then, it's um, how to navigate kind of uncertainty. And I said, our builders have gotten really good at navigating uncertainty, which isn't great, but they've kind of figured out a little bit. But I would tell you our biggest, we, quite frankly, I can't even get too concerned with tariffs today, because if our projects can't even get vertical out of the ground and can't get zoning approved and don't have utilities, then at the end of the day, that's not going to impact anything. And I look and I said, well, okay, well, there's tariffs too in Nashville and
Right.
Raleigh, and what we can control in Central Ohio is what we can control, which is our zoning, our processes, our investment in infrastructure, and these by which we do things. And I can't control tariffs, and I can't control interest rates. I think interest rates have probably impacted projects more
Mhm.
than anything. And I know on some of the larger office and mixed use, there's a lot of projects or buildings and facilities in the next year and a half who are going to see a big jump in their interest rates. And I know there's a lot of concern about that
Mhm.
kind of side of the house. Um, but what I tell local officials is let's control the things we can control,
Controllables.
and not get distracted by the big shiny object of whatever came out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue that day.
Right.
And I think that's important. And the communities that focus on the things they can control are going to win. And the folks that get distracted by whatever is the political argument of the day that they really can't affect, you know, are going to enjoy that grandstanding moment on social media, but they're not going to move the ball forward.
So I've had the pleasure of seeing you on panels and seeing you speak, and you and I have attended a lot of housing events, conversations. What's not being asked? When you're on that panel, what part of the conversation is missing? Because sometimes I feel like it's it's the easy questions. It's the ones we've heard over and over again. But there's more to it. And I think there's harder questions to be asked and probably answers that aren't always the most comfortable to give.
Boy, that's a really good question.
And I suppose it depends too on where you are in housing, right? If I'm Brandy Alisa or if I'm Ian or if I'm you, but in your world, what what opportunity or what is the thing that you don't get to say or share?
I think sometimes, and this is a broad question and not directed at any certain jurisdiction or entity. And prior to coming to the BIA, I worked in Washington doing federal lobbying, and you'd see people and they would always not take, it's a tough vote, and you'd say, well, they played it safe. And Okay.
Mhm.
Um, I never understood running for office to play it safe. And if, because I'll hear from folks who will tell me, like, boy, I really liked that the community just wasn't in favor of it. And I said, was the community not in favor of it, or were 20 people on Facebook not
That's
in
right.
favor of it, or the 15 people who wore red shirts to show up at a zoning meeting to oppose something? Um, Ultimately, you're elected to make choices, and sometimes those choices are not popular. So I think, you know, the why of why are you doing this? Everybody has acknowledged there's a need. Um, what are you going to do to make this region better, to make your community better? And there's some who've taken tough votes and lost, and some who've opted to not do so and keep their seats. And I guess the question I'd ask some of them is, was it worth it?
Right. At the end of the day.
And perhaps that is, um, that doesn't mean that and I'm gonna get in trouble with my own members here. That doesn't mean every project that one of my members all bring good projects. People who aren't BIA members do not bring good projects. Uh, but if not all projects are created equally, right? And
Right.
some are maybe not the right fit at the right time and need to be modified. And I think my members are trying to do a better job of ultimately they want to get to yes on something.
Right.
Um, but I don't know that. I guess I'd like to see a little more gumption and courage to just say, you know what, you guys are wrong.
Yeah.
Like I understand your opinion here, but you're wrong on this, and we need to do this, and here's why. I'd like to see those tough questions asked a little more, and and I think an acknowledgement that diversity and product type and what we're trying to get to as a region is is important, and that could be met in a variety of ways. But listen, there are communities. I will say this without saying anything. That's where I get myself into trouble. A few years ago, Morpsey did a housing needs assessment, and it came up with 107 different outcomes or suggestions for improving the housing environment in Central Ohio. I think it was 107. It was close to that. If you look at the funding communities that were supported the study with funds, ask yourself how many of those communities actually supported any of the initiatives, because we emailed them and didn't hear any response. And, you know, that's why I hear talk of a regional housing coalition. And my question is, okay, you're going to get some communities to sign on and give you money to put their name on the letterhead, but what are they going to actually do? And what are they going to actually commit to? Because committing to cut a check is one thing, committing to doing something is the difference. And I think, that's got to be the important part of our discussion as we move forward through this decade to 2030 is, what are you going to commit to doing?
Correct. Beyond just the performative, right?
And yeah, and again, every community is different. And I tell developing communities, what's right for the city of Columbus does not
That's
have to
right.
be right for communities outside of 270. You have to do what's the best fit for your community, but you also have to do it in something that's grounded in reality, which is, hey, we're growing as a region and we need to provide housing options. So what can we do in our community to meet the needs of a growing region that also suits our community today? And that can't mean half acre lots in
That's
perpetuity.
right. So as we talk about 2025 to 2030, where do we go in the next 5 years? What do you see?
I I'm sure everybody who's sat in any, public facing job says the same thing, which is this is the most critical time in our region's history. We say that every 4 years. It's the most crucial presidential election. Um, I do think in the next 5 years, the decisions we make are going to decide whether this region will continue to grow and thrive as it has, or if we will stagnate as a region moving forward. And I say that by, um, you know, when you talk about Columbus, people talk about the vibrancy of the region, right? We're the place that a lot of our students, when they graduate from
Mhm.
college or they graduate from high school, if they want to move to the Columbus region because we've got great jobs, we've got a great city, we've got great suburban communities. There's just a lot to like. It's easy to get around. Um, if we're not careful, we're going to lose some of those young people because they're going to move to a place where they can't afford. I just as again anecdotal stuff, but um, one of our board members was telling me his son and his daughter-in-law had been renting a place in Westerville for some period of time, and they wanted to buy a place, couldn't find a place,
Mm.
so they moved back to Knox County. Now, Knox County is a great place. We also represent builders out there. But these are folks who wanted to be closer to the city
Sure.
for work purposes, and they could not find a housing option. And that's going to be a problem. Um, that's going to be a problem for the region if we can't solve that problem. Specifically, our young workers.
Right.
You know, um, that's part of what has made this region so successful. So how do we keep that? And then, also making sure our active adults have a place they can stay attached to the communities that they've lived in. And the only way to do that is to provide housing options at all price points and for communities to rethink how they're built. So I think over the next 5 years, the decisions that we make on how we invest in infrastructure, how we invest in schools, and how we look at the building and development process as a whole are going to dictate a lot of this region's success. And that's why when you and I've talked, and I was glad the city of Columbus started its zone in update, last year and past that. But I also think they got to hurry up and finish this thing. We don't have time to wait for a multi-year process. And I understand there are a lot of boxes to check in a city of the size of the city of Columbus, but you know, the phrase that I have, it's a historical phrase from Martin Luther King, which is the fierce urgency of now. And if you believe this is a crisis, then you need to treat it as a crisis. But what we have is a community that has said, "Oh, we're in a housing crisis, but we're not going to really do anything until we have kind of the next meeting where we're going to say the same thing again." So the old, "Don't confuse activity for action."
Right.
It's time for some action.
I have said to people over the years that I think Central Ohio is really lucky to have someone who is genuinely committed and as passionate as you are around housing. And it's it's something I hear a lot about how when people get the opportunity to hear you talk about it on a panel in a larger conversation, you always speak truth. And you do it in a way where I've seen you do it when there have been other elected officials who've maybe alluded to things that you maybe didn't agree with. And you always stand true in what you believe and what you believe on behalf of the BIA. And I think that's incredibly commendable. So
Oh,
thank you.
well, you're welcome. I am really fortunate to have, you know, 500 plus bosses at the BIA. But when you think of some of the people who work in this industry and the people that I get to interact with on a regular basis, um, that's been something that they have emphasized, which is the organization's reputation. The organization is going to be was here before me. It's going to be here after me. You know, my predecessors, Jim Hills, Tom Hart, et cetera, have you did a great job of setting that foundation. And you know, when you I tell people it's so funny to me that the builders and developers get demonized. When you look at the people that are in this industry and what they've contributed to this community, when you think of like Bob Weiler has
Ah,
probably like 100% approval rating, and you think of the impact that Mr. Weiler and Mr. Kelly and the Edwards family and the Schottenstein family, and you go through all of these great legacies, and then I was just George Skestis from
ah,
Homewood, and and I say that because we adopted a dog from Gigi's last week. So
Oh,
um, that's what happens when I go out of town. I come back and there's a dog. Um, but we have great folks who have contributed to this community and continue to do so. Even our younger
that's
developers
right.
are engaged, and if we need to lean into that. And so, while I appreciate the kind words, number one, they would not be pleased if I said anything that wasn't true. But the second thing is, I get the privilege of advocating for people who just want to build homes for people,
That's right.
and I can wake up easily and do that every day. I Not everybody's has that privilege, so I'm very fortunate, and they give me good information. And I've had them say, "Hey, lean in on this. Maybe this one we can give on," and that's
Right.
amazing.
Well, and I think too, you bring up a good point. We are really fortunate to have Crawford Hoying.
Yeah.
And we talk about, Yarmir and what his vision has been. And we look around downtown with Edwards, et cetera. We're fortunate to have visionary and also risk takers to be able to bring these things into Columbus and help shape who we are.
Eh, It's before the Great Recession, the BIA had 350 builder members, and we have 150 plus now. And some of those naturally kind of,
Sure.
but people don't realize there are people that go out of business
That's right.
trying to do this and have risked everything and lost a lot to try to build homes and to contribute to this community. And you know, we should celebrate the great ones, and they've done so much for this region. But there needs to be an acknowledgement. This is not a risk-free enterprise.
That's right.
And again, when you look at the history of these companies and how they've started out and how they've built, almost all of them were started out on, you know, first generation building from nothing to where they are today. So we're really fortunate, and again, risk takers. You mentioned Crawford Hoying. What they've done at Bridge Park is fantastic. But you also look what they're doing in communities like Dayton now.
Sure.
I mean, they're risking capital. They're doing things to try to reinvent some of our cities and in across the state, and should be celebrated for doing so.
So as you lead in the housing space, it overlaps with transit. It overlaps with a lot of other things. And so in wrapping up, I'd like to ask, when you hear people talk about the Columbus way, how would you describe, or what is your definition of the Columbus way?
Yeah, I was thinking for our listeners, Betsy told me I was going to get this question.
Just this one.
And I've thought a lot about this, and I think what I would like to talk about is what we would like it to be.
Ah,
And that doesn't mean that it's not this
sure.
right now. But I think, to me, the Columbus way in the past and in the future has to be doing the right thing without fear of political backlash from the public and private sector. And um, it's just that simple. And it won't always be popular, but it will always be the right thing. And again, that's why we have leaned on the leaders in the business community and the political community to say, you know what, this may not be popular today, but we've got to do this for the region. And I think doing hard things
I like,
collaboratively.
I like that one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and talking more about housing. It's
It,
always really interesting when we get the chance to connect and talk about all these good things.
Thank you for having me. And we just always like to remind people that in all the talks about growth in Central Ohio, a home is where a job goes at night.
That's right.
And we talk a lot about bringing jobs, and we should. But it's just important to think about where those people are going to live, how they're going to get to work, and where they're going to get to go to school.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Betsy.